All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Hugo Estornello Silva. I'm the Latin America correspondent for Navarra Confidencial. And today we're going to do a new webinar slash a conference with two amazing guests, which are John Médaille, who's a distributist and business scholar from the University of Dallas, and TJ Roberts, who is a libertarian activist and a member of the Republican Party. So we're going to talk about how to fight statism in the US. So hello and welcome, John, and welcome, TJ. I'm going to ask you first to introduce yourselves a little bit, to tell the audience what is your job, what is your what are your studies, and so they can know about you a little bit more. Let's begin with John. Are you hearing me, John?
I can't hear anything.
Oh, I was telling you that we're going to ask you to do an introduction and an introduction for yourself, so the audience can know you a little better.
Okay, I can't hear you. I can only see the chat. I am John Médaille.
I think we're having some trouble with the audio. All right, I'm going to go with TJ, and I'm gonna help you try to set up your audio.
Okay,
right.
So should I introduce myself right now? Okay,
yeah.
Sure, yeah. My name's TJ Roberts. I am a law school student at Solomon P. Chase College of Law. Particularly the thing that has people interested in me in terms of this whole conversation is I'm a writer for the Advocates for Self-Government. I am also a political consultant. I help people get elected to state level offices such as state representative and state senate, things along those lines. Throughout these times, some of the campaigns I have been on have been Thomas Massie for Congress, Rand Paul for U.S. Senate, Savannah Maddox for state representative. The list goes on, but ultimately the big thing that I'm looking at is what can we do to preserve liberty and expand liberty through realistic means within our times. Because the fact of the matter is that when it comes down to it, we need to be looking for real results for real people.
All right. I hope that John has his audio back. Are you hearing us? Oh, jeez. Wait a sec.
It doesn't work.
Now it's working. Now it's working. Now it's working. Well, we'll have to continue with you until John connects. So you're telling me that you work to get people elected to state level offices, right?
Yes.
So why, if you're a libertarian, more or less, why do you prefer to work with the Republicans instead of the Libertarian Party?
Sure. So one of the things that's unique about the United States system is that we truly are a two-party system. Unfortunately, that's just the way that the country's been built to be. It's not the ideal situation, but whenever you look at this two-party system, you realize that there is a very wide diversity of ideas within those two parties. Rand Paul and Thomas Massie are very different from Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, for example. There's a fundamental difference between these individuals. And because of that, I view political parties as something that is without ideology in America. Their only goal is to get members of their party into positions of power. I am a libertarian. I believe in limiting the government as much as possible. I'm also a cultural conservative in the context that I believe that Western civilization matters. That private property is best expanded whenever we have a value for faith, family, and freedom. So within the Republican Party, those values resonate with the everyday voters in that system. So when it comes down to it, political parties are an essential piece to it. And I believe that the Republican Party is the best means for libertarians to get elected. Look at Rand Paul and Thomas Massey. They're not exactly authoritarians that many members of the Republican Party are, but they still give us results. At the state level, we can look at Kentucky alone. Savannah Maddox is a great candidate that I was involved with her race in 2018. Within her first year of getting elected, we managed to pass not only constitutional carry, which is your right to carry a concealed firearm and the means to defend yourself without permission from the government, without a license. We also got the Campus Free Speech Act passed. This was a protection of free expression and free speech on college campuses, which are breeding grounds of leftism. Because of this bill being passed, conservatives and libertarians have the ability to stand up and propose their ideas and provide an alternative to the left-wing narrative on campus. These reforms, while they may seem to be something that is insignificant in the whole light of things with all the status stuff that we have to deal with, for your everyday person, the ability to defend yourself and the ability to speak your mind is everything to them. The ability to offer a counter, the ability to, when it comes down to it, to defend your life over the lives of others, that is everything. That's what keeps you going. That's what gives your ideas a chance.
Right. Thank you, TJ. I hope that John's audio is working. So
Okay, I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So first, I'm gonna ask you to introduce yourself a bit, to tell us what are your studies, what's your occupation, and then I'm gonna ask you about your political stance. So.
Well, I teach a course in Catholic social teaching to business students at the University of Dallas. I came to this from 40 years in business myself, but having been bored by it, I took a master's degree in theology at the University of Dallas just at the time when they were setting up their business program. And they wanted their business program, since it is a Catholic university, they wanted their business students to have a background in Catholic social teaching. And they asked me to set up that program. I did so, and I found out there were no textbooks to do that, so I had to write my own textbook, The Vocation of Business, Social Justice in the Marketplace. And that one I followed up with a book on distributism toward a truly free market. And so that's my background in this question.
And what's your political stance? Because, well, for the case of TJ, he's a libertarian Republican, but for your case, well, we know you're lean towards the social Catholic doctrine, but yes. What about your political views and perspectives and beliefs?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question quite.
Oh. No, what are your political beliefs more or less in a party system?
Oh, the party. Well, I mean, it depends on the country. A two-party system always brokers power. Multi-party systems broker ideas. So if you have two parties, because obviously you have more than two political opinions, so what you're really doing is brokering power, putting together various alliances to get a majority, and then trying to broker those alliances legislatively, et cetera, et cetera. So our system is a two-party system. It's a power brokerage system, so that's the system we work with. Yeah. Myself, I'm part of the American Solidarity Party, but I'm pretty sure they won't win the next election.
Can you tell us a little bit about that American Solidarity Party? I've never heard of it, so for me, it's
well, yeah, obviously it's a small third party, and it's not going to get a whole lot of traction. But they're based on the principles of Catholic social teaching, solidarity, subsidiarity, and so it's I view it as an sort of a process of education. So whereas it won't win elections, the history of the United States is that third parties do have an influence if they get enough followers, because one or the other parties will appropriate that third party and try to bring it in. So that's pretty much what happens in American history.
Right. Now I'm going to ask you like the first question on
Sure.
topic, which is what do you think is happening with the wow? How do you explain that the American government, the American state, is gaining so much influence on private spheres, such as the market, such as private life, and so on? We'll go first with John, since his audio is working, and then with you, TJ.
Okay, the question is, I'm not sure what the question is here. How is the American government getting so much power over the markets? Is that what you, is that?
Not only so over the markets, but over private spheres, such as markets, such as family, such as anything that is by nature private.
Yeah, well, I reject the premise of the question. The neat division of life into public and private simply has no basis historically, factually, or ideologically. There's no business isn't private, business is social. How can you have private business? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, what does that term even mean? And you don't have any business at all, and never have had. There's not a single example in human history of business without government, because business is a set of rules, okay? And to have rules, you need to have a rule maker and a rule enforcer. You might think of business or any other area of life as a game, as a football game, say. Well, you can't have a game without rules, okay? And you can't have rules without a referee. So this fantasy of having a purely private sphere is just that. There's no where would you look in history to find such a thing? It has never happened, it never could happen, it never will happen. And in the case of capitalism, it's especially ridiculous, because capitalism was a state project from the beginning. There has never been a private capitalism. You cannot point to one period in history to view this strange creature. It doesn't exist, it hasn't existed, it will never exist. So I think you have to ask a different question. The question you have to ask is, what is the proper sphere for socialized goods, and what is the proper sphere for common goods? Because all markets rely on a foundation of socialized goods. They rely on a market, on a foundation of a social environment and physical infrastructures and laws, social expectations. If somebody can point to me to a single day in history, to a single system where that was not true, then they'd have a case. But it simply has not happened and cannot happen.
Thank you, John. Now I'm going to you, TJ. So the question originally was, how do you explain that the government is having so much influence on the private sphere? But since John gave a very unexpected answer, I think that you can give another perspective on it.
Sure. So when it comes down to it, when we look at the development of civilization, we had the alternatives of we really were in a state of war at the very beginning. One of the things Ludwig von Mises points out is that our point, and by war I'm speaking on the Hobbesian notion of before civilization, it was man against man. It was society. It wasn't a civilized system. Ludwig von Mises concurs with this opinion in the point that the state of nature is a state of poverty. So ultimately, people developed civilizations to develop for themselves as well. Now, into your question regarding state intrusion into people's lives, I would say that most of it, especially in the modern days with the development of the coronavirus, it's largely based on fear itself. Now, to go into the notion that capitalism itself existed only through the state, I would maintain that we can see instances of capitalism within what would largely be considered prehistoric times with the early development of currency. While it's not necessarily recorded in terms of this all, but we can see that with the development of money, with currency, we had a barter system to an extent of, I have this, you have that, we'll trade this for that, and we're both better off. What the problem with that was the lack of a double coincidence of once. So we developed a currency system not as a state, but as a society, whereas people took commonly valued goods, like, for example, salt was one of the first currencies, for example, where people would trade between that because it was easily divisible, it was transportable, it was preservable, things along those lines. It, of course, developed into gold, for example. That was something that was done within the private market. The state began to dilute that, and ultimately we see greater interference within the devaluation of our currencies. Devaluation it was a form of a taxation where the state would take parts of it within our systems. Now, the whole thing is like, when it comes down to it, the state's intrusion into our lives is because the state is inherently an expansionist entity. Its goal is to expand as far into the lives of other people as far as they can get away with it. So that's one of the biggest explanations, is that whenever people are confronted with things that truly scare them, in the early 2000s, terrorism, for example, now sicknesses, viruses, we are at this point to where people are willing to give up their liberties in order to feel a sense of security. Whether that security is real or not, that's an entirely different discussion. So ultimately, I would say that the intrusion into people's private lives is largely stemming from fear of whether it be the unknown or even the known.
Thank you, TJ. Oh, I think I have like an answer for John about a time in history where there was like no state a set of rules for anything, which are the Middle Ages. Some authors think that the Middle Ages were pretty much an example of a private society. I don't really know if that's true, but I like the idea for it to be. But let's go to the next question. Oh, if you want, John, you can.
Okay, wait a second. Could I respond to TJ on that?
All right, do it.
Okay, first place, he starts with a Hobbesian definition of society. But Hobbes was not a historian. Hobbes was not an economist. Hobbes was writing to support, and it's funny he should do this, because Hobbes' whole idea was that you needed this powerful state. And so he starts with this state of nature that simply did not exist. We know anthropologically how civilization develops, and it was like nothing you see in Hobbes or in Mises. Okay, and people were in self-organized communities, and they were not individuals. They were groups, tribes, and extended families. As far as currency, we know very well the history of money. The history of money begins in about 700 BC in the Greek-speaking portions of Asia Minor, and it has a very specific use. All right, and prior to that, you had great civilizations, empires, business enterprises, trading enterprises, all without the use of money. It was strictly a basis of credit. And it was never a barter system. Barter systems never happen. Okay, they happen only briefly after collapses. Money does not begin in barter. The problem of the dual coincidence is just too great. It cannot be overcome. In village life, you don't use money. You use a free circulation of gifts. So in the mythology of the libertarians, if a fisherman wants some shoes, he takes his excess fish and finds a cobbler who will make him some shoes for that fish. That never happens. What happens in village economies, and this is well known, the fisherman brings his surplus and distributes it freely. That gets him honor in the village. Being an honorable man, some woman will see that he's wearing tatty moccasins, and that's not suitable for a man of honor. So she makes him a pair of moccasins, and that brings her honor. That's how villages work. Now, you have these great empires. Well, how did they do it? We know because we have their accounting records. Okay, because the Babylonians kept their accounting records on clay tablets, which they then baked and last for thousands and thousands of years. We have tens and thousands of these tablets, and they're all accounting records. What did they use in money? They used basically credit cards. Recorded what you did and therefore what people owed you, okay? And it was a credit system. And that's what money is a credit system. All right, now in the 700 BC, what they began to do to provision the army was instead of giving supplies to the soldiers, they gave them coins. And then they demanded the coins back as taxes, you see? And this set up a circulation system. Everybody, why should somebody accept these coins for a bushel of wheat? Well, because they would need the coin to pay their taxes. That's how money systems began, okay? And this proved so useful that it spread rapidly. But before that, there was no money system, nor was there a barter system. There was a credit system. And money today is still credit. Always has been, always will be.
May I respond a little bit? All right, excellent. So one of the things is I believe in the reason why I believe in the Hobbesian perspective of man before civilization is largely due to the work of Lawrence Keeley, particularly his book War Before Civilization, which points out that there's archaeological evidence of how warfare worked, which ultimately largely led to the developments of civilization, was to stave off the invading violence within the struggle for resources in the early days of humanity. Now, in regards to the Hobbesian notion of the need for a state, that's where I dissent from it. I believe that there needs to be strong social institutions, but I don't believe that necessarily has to be the state. This could be the church, this could be the family, this could be the market, this could be the community. There's plenty of alternatives to a monopoly on violence that we could all generally agree upon as a better alternative to this notion within it. Now, in regards to the argument regarding currency, that the barter system never existed. When we look at prehistory, it's hard to really see what happened in terms of what did they do before there was any recordings of it. It's more of a logical perspective of there is a double coincidence of once that is an insurmountable problem, as John properly pointed out. The thing is that what did people do with it? They developed a currency, and I would agree that it was rather quick, and probably barter systems did come in the midst of collapses. So that is a correct notion that he pointed out. What's incorrect, however, is to state that ultimately it was only within 700 BC. We don't really know what prehistoric human beings did. There's some evidence of it, but there's also evidence of that a currency of a medium of exchange rather than a credit system did in fact emerge within it. Now, in regards to the gift economy notion that John is pointing out, all of this seems like another form of capitalism in which there is voluntary exchange among individuals within a community. That's not inherently showing the need for a state for intervention. That's not necessarily showing that it's communal. This is all the private decisions. Yes, humans privately decide that they value community. That's not necessarily wrong, and that's not the thing. What I'm looking at in terms of what I mean by collective or intrusion upon private life is that which is not voluntary. If we were looking at individualism in the perspective of a Robinson Crusoe type of thing, I would agree that's not how humanity developed. However, what John's pointing out is that people wanted to do this. They wanted to develop civilizations. They wanted to develop tribes. They wanted to develop communities. that's entirely compatible with the political theory of libertarianism, in which people work within a voluntary system. In fact, I would say that what he's providing for is particularly what I'm trying to advocate for in terms of a strong civilization, in terms of strong communities, strong families, and strong churches as an alternative to the state, in which we provide for ourselves over having a strong central authority that monopolizes it and makes this happen by force.
Well, in fact, we know a great deal about what happens in prehistoric communities because they still exist. Okay, it is not something you have to think about what happened. Oh, how can we think about these things? There's data, there's evidence. Okay, so you go into the jungles of Brazil and you find prehistoric communities. You go to Africa, you find prehistoric communities. You go to Laos today. I worked in these prehistoric communities. I spent 2 years in Vietnam and I worked with the Montagnards, okay? That is not how these communities work, okay? So it's not something we have to guess about. It's something we can, in fact, know. Now, the place of war, all right, in the development of civilization. This is very true because what happens is that, now, first place, it is not voluntary. There is no individualism. There is no such thing as an individual, okay? We all are called forth into being by an act of love into a ready-made community of the family. From this community of the family, we receive not exchanges, but pure gifts. We see first the gift of being, and then the gift of love, and then the gift of our language, and then the gift of our ethnicity, all the cultural norms that are given to us. They're not voluntary, they're not exchanges, they're gifts. And it is gift that it is at the basis of all life, all being, all civilization. Now these abstract thinkers, operating without any historical data whatsoever, come up with these wonderful ideas, okay, but they cannot find any history for them, okay, because they're all abstractions. They exist in the pages of a book, but they don't exist in real life and never have. Now, as far as government, if you want to really find intrusive government, go to a village, okay? The village elders will tell you, you know, what you can do, where you can live, what portion of the area you can farm, what your hunting rights are, okay, who you can marry, okay, how you will marry. All of these things are dictated culturally, okay? To say that they're just free exchanges, it's like saying, well, you freely decided to speak English, or you freely, Hugo, freely decided to speak Spanish. You did nothing of the sort. Of course not. How could that even be? So the whole purpose of a civilization is to free the will. That's quite true. But it doesn't begin in freedom. All right? Freedom is a potentiality in man, not an actuality. It takes a whole life to develop freedom. Right? But we start out, we are not free in any possible sense of that term. And our decisions are not isolated. They're culturally conditioned, they're socially conditioned. There's a lot of factors that go into making our decisions, which is the whole basis of advertising, by the way. So to posit a pure freedom, rather than freedom as a potential which we develop throughout our lives, it just doesn't match any social, personal, political reality that I can see. It's all just abstractions.
Okay.
Let me. I have a counter argument because,
sure,
especially in the love and marriage aspect, there has to be some kind of voluntary exchange. I mean, for a man and a woman to decide they want to live together and to form a family and to have children, there has to be some kind of free will for them to decide that. Mm-hmm. So I think that can be a counter argument on how civilization forms and how it's created by a free will exchange of wills. for people to decide effectively, no, we want to form a family, we want to form a community.
No, that could happen. Yes, that could happen, and often does happen. Although it often does happen in more advanced civilizations. Usually, village elder tells you, "Well, Hugo, you're marrying Maria," and that's the way that works. Marriages are set for dynastic reasons, okay, for tribal reasons. So if you, like I say, if you want to really see, a centralized state, go to the village. That's where you find it. And people leave the village because they find village life too oppressive. Villages have to do that because it's a matter of survival. It's not a matter of individual, freeing individuals for self-expression. That's a very modern notion. It's a matter of, well, this is what the village needs to survive. Because survival is always thought of not in terms of individualism, but in terms of the survival of the community. Okay.
All right, now you go, TJ.
Sure, yeah. One of the things in terms of this is I think that we have a fundamental disagreement on the notion of freedom. One of the things that you're talking about is that one of the points of coercion is through cultural means or through social norms. I don't see that as a revocation of freedom. Quite the opposite. I would actually say that the development of culture and social norms is an expression of freedom, of people of similar mindsets coming together to develop this. You look at you look at the village. One of the points that you mentioned is that people leave in order to avoid the coercion. I would say that is an ultimate expression of freedom, is your ability to leave. Unlike the state that we have right now, which is as centralized, where we have one system governing 300 some million people within the United States. The cost of leaving is so high that it's impermissible to the everyday individual like you and me. Whereas within the village, sure, you're probably going to face some hardships over it, but it's still attainable to leave that in order to pursue better pastures for yourself if you are not satisfied within those conditions. Mm-hmm. Now, yes, there's a great degree of social control within villages. I don't disagree with you in that. In the same way that there's a degree of social control within families, within churches. But that's the thing, is that these are all institutions that, while you're born into and you're acclimated into, it's not a system that's inherently governed by violence. If you choose to leave this, we will kill you. That's not the way that things are within these social institutions that we're discussing here. But that's my whole take on it, and I'm really enjoying this discussion here, actually. But so thank you so much for this.
All right. Do you want to add something, John?
Well, I mean, it seems that you've conceded the major point, that we in fact don't have freedom, or can only get freedom by leaving something. But in fact, leaving something does not confer freedom, it confers isolation. And there is nothing less free than isolation. There is nothing less free than, having to gather roots and berries to live on. And the point here is that freedom is not purely individual. Freedom is social. Okay, people live under the direction of the village elders or of the state, et cetera, because it confers a kind of freedom. And that you were correct, but I think in such a way that negates your original thesis. So freedom is social. And the whole point of a proper social system is to allow people to realize their freedom. But this cannot be done individually, okay? It's a social system. The whole basis of individualism is simply nonsense. It's a non-starter. It cannot exist. We can only be free together, okay? Or slaves separately. So our social life either tends toward freedom or doesn't. Now, the problem I think you have, and I think you're identifying the wrong target, the problem is not government. Government has always been about the same size as it is today. The problem has been centralization, okay? The capital city, which developed in the late Middle Ages. Before that, we didn't have capital. Well, you had Rome, the Roman Empire, things like that. But in the Middle Ages, you didn't have, in the early Middle Ages, you didn't have capital cities. Wherever the king's court was, and it could be Aix-la-Chapelle, it could be Rouen, it could be Paris, it wasn't important. When you developed, and the kings began to centralize all power in their hands. And the powers that had been relegated to the church, the powers that had been relegated to the corporations, all began to centralize. But these powers still existed. There wasn't any less government. There was more diffuse government. And that's a totally different notion, and one that's difficult for the libertarian to comprehend. So our problem has been centralization rather than the modern problem has been centralization of all authority rather than, as it was before, a series of contending authorities. So you always had the church-state struggle. You always had the commons versus the nobility struggle. You always had the cities, the free cities versus the prince struggle. And that's what it was. It was a series of overlapping authorities. And on the edges, there's always these conflicts. The conflicts were resolved by Hobbes just by turning over all power to the king. And so by the late 16th century, especially the 17th and 18th century, you got the all-powerful monarch, which, by the way, didn't even exist in empires, didn't exist in the Roman Empire, didn't exist in the Persian Empire, etc. So that's been the modern problem, is centralization, not power.
And now I'm going to go with the next question, because I think that's a great point to start off. So what is the system by becoming centralized? Let's say the village elders, the government, the king's court, whatever. What if the system is oppressive by becoming centralized? Well, it does become oppressive by becoming centralized. What does that mean to freedom, both social and individual? I think we'll go with TJ, because you were the last two.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is... Sure, yeah. I mean, the biggest thing between John and I believe, is just a difference in definitions of freedom. So I'll just focus on the individual aspects of the freedom. And if John wants to handle the cultural side, we can talk about that. Because the thing is that when it comes down to it, the further decentralized you have your civilizations, the more individual input, your individual input matters within those systems, right? Like take a small village, take my small city, for example. I have a much greater ability to influence the decisions being made there than I do at the United States federal level. I have the ability to leave if I'm fully dissatisfied by it. For example, if I lived in an area where, I don't know, to where the property taxes are so high that my rent is completely unaffordable, I have the ability to leave. I have the ability to go to another city, right? As things further centralize, though, to where all the decisions are being made within one place, instead of, say, my small city with only 600 residents, I'm looking at the federal government of 380 million people. I'm just a number. I don't matter in the grand scheme of things. But when it comes down to it, the further decentralized, the more you get to a voluntary system to where it's not predicated upon a monopoly of violence. It's predicated upon individual input of I have agreed to live under these social norms. It's something that I want to live under. While, yes, you have the hardcore individuals that would say that I'm a rabid statist for saying that I believe that my city government matters in my everyday life, I'd maintain that my city government can serve as a defense against centralization, as a defense against the tyranny of the mob within 380 million people. That's one of the biggest points that I have in regards to this, is that the best way to fight for freedom, especially at the individual level, is at your state and local level.
Okay, well, we don't disagree on that point. I mean, and so we can agree now that the problem is not so much power as the centralization of power. And that power will be the same because no matter whether you're at the village level or at the global level, power will more or less be the same. The problem is the remoteness of power. So a medieval craftsman probably worked under as many regulations as does any modern business. The difference was the guild set the rules in cooperation with the city, and maybe there was some influence from the prince and the church. The church had enormous commercial powers to set commercial rules. So it was sort of a negotiation between a lot of different powers, which began with the guild itself. So it wasn't a matter of how many rules there were. There have to be rules or you can't have commerce. It was a matter of who gets to set the rules, who has a place at the table in rule setting. And this, we would, I think, both agree that this is better achieved under diverse systems where there's in Catholic social teaching, we call this subsidiarity, okay? Subsidiarity where there are levels of society, and the purpose of the levels of society is that the higher levels exist only to serve the lower levels. Now, in natural hierarchies, they reverse that. You know, we're all here to serve the king or whatever, or the corporation or the oligarchs. Okay, but in subsidiarity, a higher level of organization is only justified by the aid, or in Latin subsidium, it can give to the lower levels. And at the lowest level, the most important level is the family.
Now, well, I think I can make just a comment about this, because well, we see that the family is like the first functional cell of any civilization, right? But we can also say that the family is the first cell of any state or state-like institution. So we can equate, in a sense, state is pretty much civilization or not. And that goes for DJ, because I know he's going to be against this proposition.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. We can like, in a sense, make equal state as civilization, in the sense that both state and both civilization are born out of families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would maintain that the state itself is not civilization. I would maintain that there are alternatives to the state. If we define state as the institution that holds a monopoly on violence within a given territorial jurisdiction, I would maintain that there's plenty of alternatives to it. Does the state emerge out of families? Largely, yes, and you can even see even within the Misesian view that is the case within Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, From Aristocracy to Monarchy to Democracy. We can see in terms of this that families do develop civilizations that eventually emerge into states, but that's not necessarily the necessity of it. We're doing that they're doing it out of the fact that power tends to expand into a state. But that's the whole thing, is that just because it tends to do so, that doesn't necessarily mean that it should do so. So I would maintain that civilizations can exist after the state. I would actually maintain that at a certain level, local so-called governments lack the notion of statehood in the context of, sure, within this extremely small area, they have the control over it. But ultimately, the fact is that the barrier to leave is so low that their monopoly is essentially upon people who choose to stay. Right? I have a monopoly on force within my property. The things that I own, I have the discretion to make, and if in a theoretical sense, there are limitations. I can't invite you onto my property and then kill you. That's a ridiculously immoral notion. But the fact of the matter is that there's limitations to it. The more local you go, the less of a state it becomes, in my opinion.
Not convinced of that at all. And that's not
Why?
The experience. That's not the experience that people have. Furthermore, you lay great emphasis on this freedom to leave. But in fact, there is no, that freedom has to be only when you get to a certain level of organization. People cannot exist outside the community. all right? Or if they do, they exist at such a low level. So at best, you may choose another community if they'll accept you, okay? Ask the immigrants at the border whether you're just whether they're free to leave. It's merely an exchange of one set of rules for another at best, but it rarely happens, and it only happens when there is such a collapse. I mean, we get great immigration on our southern border because there's terrible collapse. We get great immigration from the Middle East into Europe because there's been a collapse of the Middle East. It really is an expression of freedom. It's an expression of exactly the opposite, necessity. They leave because they have to leave, because they can no longer have a life in the failed state of Guatemala, or they can no longer have a life in the dried up climate of the Fertile Crescent. All right. It is necessity, not freedom, that pushes them. All right. So I think the notions here that we're talking about of freedom are too simplistic, are too unrealistic. And you really need to look at the history of these questions, at what actually happens before you can, and not turn to abstract books by people who had no knowledge of history, no knowledge of anthropology, very little knowledge, and especially in Mises' case, of economics, and who started deductively. It's just all a collection of abstractions that have no historical analogs whatsoever.
Okay, so one of the things in terms of the freedom to leave, the big points that you're pointing out is that people will either exist at such a low level or they'll exchange it for another set of rules. And I don't inherently disagree with that notion. It's just that I believe that people are making their choices in accordance with what they have subjectively valued to be better. Will people make the decision? Not always. Most of the time, they're going to stick with what they know. And I agree with you on that. And I agree that there is a sense of necessity, but I don't think that necessity is inherently the negation of freedom. You need to eat, for example, in order to survive. I wouldn't necessarily say that eating for your own survival is a negation of freedom, or finding shelter or finding water, right? And talking about the border restrictions that we have, that's another conversation, which again emerges out of how far centralized the government is. It's hard to fathom a situation in which, take the U.S.-Mexico border, that we have a very decentralized system of governments, that there wouldn't be one system, in which people would be open to the notion of accepting people within it, or even further to the south. And in talking about collapses as well, further decentralization makes it to where collapses are more isolated. They're in differing areas. So when it comes down to it, I believe that when we look into it, is that decentralization is the pathway. And I don't think you would disagree with me on that from what I've heard in regards to your other statements. So I just think that ultimately, when it comes down to it, most of our disagreements are disagreements in terms of what is freedom, whether it is a communal thing or an individual thing, and if necessity impacts freedom.
That's a good point. Well,
if you're looking for me for a comment, I'd say yes. Decentralization is exactly what the modern world lacks. But the point on which they're discussing it, freedom versus being escape from rules, doing whatever you want, that's not freedom, that's license. And it always ends in slavery. Matter of fact, the reason we have a centralized states is because we became individuals. Okay, precisely because we left the family. We wanted freedom from the family. We wanted freedom from the community. When there is nothing but individualism, collectivism is the only possible governing choice. And so individualism is not contrary to collectivism. It is the foundation of collectivism. Community is the foundation of freedom. Okay, and that implies membership in a group. All right, And that's what the individualists miss. Okay.
I actually couldn't agree with you more. The fact of the matter is that when you look at communities, are the greatest negation of coercive collectivism. Families, faiths, communities at a local level.
No, they're a different form of coercion. Okay, but they're just as coercive. Believe me, if you violate community norms, you are in a world of hurt. But you're in a world of hurt, but from people who know you, and not from somebody 3,000 miles away. You're in a world of hurt from people who can understand your situation. That may or may not make it better, okay? But it certainly provides different possibilities.
There's also pity. They are going to be a lot less hurtful to you because these people know you. A bureaucrat 100 miles away from you, he's not going to care about you. He's only going to care about whatever thing you did that violates his rules or her rules.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have another question. Another question. We can go around the same thing. What about the thing about socialized goods? Because you talk about how some things in the community were gifts. And also there's the argument about markets and they are not socialized goods and so on. So we can talk a little bit about that.
Well, you talk about a false dichotomy, okay? They talk about market goods, or do they socialize the goods or market, have everything provided by the market. It's a false dichotomy because all markets depend on a fund of socialized goods. Whereas all socialized goods depend on a market to be funded. And so the proper argument is not socialism versus markets. It's what are the proper bounds and demarcations of each, all right? What goods should be socialized? What goods should be privatized? But if every entrepreneur, okay, it doesn't matter how good you are at making something. If there are no roads to take it to market, you cannot be successful. If every entrepreneur had to drill his own well, dig his own latrine, provide his own security, educate his own clients and customers and workers, and provide for the 100 other socialized services that we depend upon, he would have no time to spend with his business. Rather, establishing a business assumes a social order, a legal order, a property order, a whole bunch of socialized goods and services, or he cannot have his business. So that's the real debate. What goods should be socialized? What goods should be privatized?
All right, now it's your turn, TJ.
I mean, when it comes down to it, the notion of what goods should be privatized, what goods should be socialized, I think once again it's really a question of how are we doing this, right? The notion that we need to have a government to create roads, for example, it's really negating the options that we have within the private market, which we can see from Walter Block's books on the privatization of roads, highways, and bridges. We can see that there are options available, whether it be people having little stock within each plot of land until they have enough to build a road. Because ultimately, my biggest thing is when are we going to have what level of coercion are we going to accept? The government acceptance of roads is through the use of eminent domain, which is forcefully taking people's property and providing them what's the so-called market value in order to gain access to the land to build these roads. Now, the fact of the matter is that when we look at the difference between, at least from the perspective of the libertarian, between a private market or a communal market is which ones are going through voluntary exchanges. We build a road through voluntary exchanges. By the libertarian standard, that's a private market, whether everyone has access to it or not. So that's the biggest points of it, is that I would maintain that from the perspective of whether it be private or communal by anyone else's standards, what matters was whether or not it was funded through voluntary means, whether it was forced upon people or not.
Right. I
Okay.
think I get
Let me respond on the roads because it's very
All right.
important. The idea of a private road is totally nonsense. And if you could have it, it would quickly be suppressed. Why? You would be putting a monopoly in the middle of all economic activity. And that would be totally socially unacceptable. Nobody would permit such a thing. And in fact, you cannot build the road without eminent domain. Why? Because the last parcel is worth all the other parcels put together. So there has never been a private road, okay? Roads, railroads, canals, whatever, were always established under government sanction because there simply is no other way to do it. So you had the royal roads of the kings, and you wouldn't have the roads without there being royal roads, without the authority of the king to tell each noble, okay, you're constructing this section of the road across your domains, and et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that you could privatize that simply doesn't work. There are some rarefied examples where you can have a private road, okay? But as considered socially, the roads are a social good, not a market good. And even if you had this private road, it still wouldn't be a market good. It would merely be a social good that was privatized because you can't have competing roads on the same route, all right? You can't have 5 competing roads on the same route. You can't have 5 sewer lines going outside my house and they're all competing with each other. You can't have 5 electrical cables supplying power to my house and I get to choose one, okay? So in all of those cases, those would be socialized goods. You might privatize them, but it still wouldn't be a market good. It would just be a privatized socialism, that's all.
Well, I think I get most of the point. Go on.
Okay, so yeah, to address the last parcel notion as the most valuable piece, suppose that there's a person in the middle of this straight line of road that I have been trying to purchase who refuses to sell the parcel to me at any price. There's nothing negating me from just going around that parcel, finding an alternative route. Is it going to be less efficient? Yes, but I'm willing to sacrifice efficiency for voluntarism. I'm willing to make it to where that road has a seemingly nonsensical curve in it that at least allows for it to be that every parcel of road that I purchased was voluntarily acquired. It may take more time, yes, but at least at this point, every party that I have consented, and I didn't have to take this from them. I have a meeting in 15 minutes, so just wanted to make sure that that's clear on that in terms of time.
Has there ever been such a road in all of human? Has there ever been such a road in all of human history? I mean, when you say, well, I'll just go around it, all you're doing is creating a new last parcel, and you have the same problem. And if you then detour around all the last parcels, all you're doing is imposing a social cost on every user of that road to circle around your last parcel problem. Okay, so you still have the same problem, you've just relocated it. That's why eminent domain under some form, whether it be the royal road, the eminent road domain we use today, whatever it might be, has always been the method of building roads. It cannot be otherwise.
See, I don't like using what has been done before as what is within the realm of possibility. Because what has been done before, sure, that shows like it absolutely can be done, but just because something hasn't been done before doesn't mean that it's impossible. And in terms of how these can work, I think I think that the fact of the matter is that yes, there is a social cost, but there can be competing to the same routes. Look at, for example, I-75, which goes from Michigan to Florida. You also have US Highway 25, which goes from Michigan to Florida. It takes longer to take US 25, but let's suppose that Company A owns I-75, Company B owns US 25. These ultimately go to the same places, and people would have the opportunity to choose which firm they go through. I'm not saying that's a perfect example, but it's just the mere fact that when it comes down to it, yes, there's only so much land, so there's a limited amount of competition, but ultimately competition is possible, especially whenever you look at the fact that there are roads that ultimately do go to the same place. And I don't see any reason why US 25 and I-75 have to be owned by the same people.
well, first place, they could be owned by the same people, okay? Because the owner of I-75 is going to drive out of business the owner of 25 and acquire his property and establish a monopoly. But and you just believe that could be resolved by pricing is just, I think, unrealistic. As to the point of a thing never having a historical analog, an example that you can point to, you raise here the idea that there's somebody, in 10,000 years of human history, these ideas have never occurred to anybody and never tried it. And until, Ludwig von Mises came along and revealed the truth to us, humans were just stupid and didn't know this. Well, humans knew it very well. And they've answered all of these questions. Just about everything that could be tried was tried. And what survives is what works, okay? So I'm very suspicious of abstract ideas with no historical analog. They are, in my opinion, to be feared, because that's some damned intellectual someplace thinking up great thoughts, oh, this is what the people ought to do, and anybody can do that. It's a fool's game. I can come up with 10 perfect systems in an afternoon. It's not even clever. But if I can't show a historical analog for them, then there's reason to doubt that there is no historical analog because it's an impossibility.
I think that last thing before I really have to go, but I think that mindset is what would have kept us out of space travel if we had really adapted to that. Is the fact that it had never been done before, and therefore we really need to make sure that
it's not technology. Okay.
I would say that technology is essential to establishing systems, though. The
Absolutely.
further technology advances, the more possibilities that we have that were never accomplished.
Absolutely. The systems don't change, okay, because we have technology, okay. The possibilities change, but you still have the same systemic problems whether you have the technology or not.
I think we're gonna cut it with this. Just a last comment, and then we're going to go to the question round, to the question and answer round. Well, I think that the main point about what John said, and with some of what TJ said, is that in a sense there's always going to be a socialized goods, because even if it's only a community that does this, the community will have to distribute a certain good for everyone to compete, to exist in a market. For example, let's say land. The community is established, and then you have to distribute the land that the community controls as a polity for everyone to establish themselves, for everyone to establish some kind of economic practice, to some kind of economic entrepreneurship, and so on. So the basis of all free markets is, all in all, some kind of socialized good that it can be socialized like in a few days ago or a very, very long time ago. Right, so let's go to the question section. There are 3 questions that I can think that we can answer. The first one is, how does the state have had always the same size or power? Do primitive communities can be regarded as states?
Okay, how does the state always have the same size of power? Do primitive communities, can they be regarded as the states? Well, certainly as analogous to states, yes. Okay, but again, the question is distance. The community is, you may not like the elder, and you probably don't, but the distance between you and the elder is different. I think, well, the medieval peasant paid more taxes than we do. Not the rich, of course, but that's the same as today. The rich don't pay taxes. But, so yeah, I think the government, because there's a certain level of social organization that's always required, whether you're a community or a global community, there's a certain level of social control that is exercised So that's going to be a constant throughout history. Okay, but the location of government, that's not a constant. That changes from society to society.
All right. Now with you, TJ, which I think it's going to be your last intervention.
I would maintain that when it comes down to it, in terms of how the state has maintained its power, is that it's inherently expansionist. Whereas, as I point out, that advancements in technology allow for new advancements within systems, it also allows for newer means for the government to take control over you. So that's the thing with it, is that, again, it's expansion. It's within its nature, and the people within the state, they desire the power in order to decide what goes within their territorial jurisdiction. That's the way that they operate. Whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, entirely different question. Anyway, I must go. Thank you all so much. You guys have.
I enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, TJ. So we're now going to answer all the questions with you only, John.
Okay.
So,
that's kind of excited, but all right.
There's another question in the same line that says, what caused us to develop and achieve our current standard of life?
What caused
what are the factors that are responsible for the success in Western civilization?
Okay, what caused us to develop and achieve our current standards of life? What are the factors responsible for the success in Western society? Well, obviously, it's hard to answer that without knowing what is meant by success. Okay, if you mean, what helps us to achieve the suburbs, or what helps us to achieve automobiles, or something like that, I can give some answers. I'm not sure what here is actually meant for the success in Western society. If you mean the Western society domination of the world, then it's military power. Okay, we dominate South America militarily and economically, because we were more willing to project power. The development of capitalism has always been the expansion of power and the projection of that power globally, both internally and globally. So capitalism develops by enclosing the commons, by taking away the rights from local farmers, by destroying village life and then centralizing everything in the cities. Okay, that's how capitalism was so successful, by destroying that base that came before it. So I'm not quite sure what the question is, so that is probably an inadequate answer, for which I apologize.
All right. Now I think we're going to go to the last question. How can we define the collusion of big business with big government?
Oh, well, we could start by enforcing the law. So in the United States, we have antitrust laws, but since the imposition of the Bork Doctrine, they've stopped enforcing the antitrust laws. So we can break up the big corporations and distribute them around. But I'll tell you, there's one change we could make that would destroy a lot of the big corporations, and that is deals with removing their subsidies, removing their tax advantages, and removing the subsidy, for example, of the highway system. The highway system is highly subsidized. The big box store could not exist if there were weight and distance tolls on the roads. They would collapse. And then the companies that would be successful were those that could shorten their supply lines, shorten their distribution chains, and relocalize and regionalize the economy, get from the global economy down to the regional and the local economy. So that's one change you could make. So there's two things you could do then. Break up the monopolies and end the subsidies, particularly the highway subsidies. And you could think of a dozen more along those lines. But the corporation is powerful because it has the backing of the state. And that's the only reason.
Well, I think instead of breaking the big corporations, I think a way of breaking the state as it currently is. The first of it is the state is mechanized. It works the same way it works as any corporation would work. It has a division of labor. It has a lot of people working for it, and it can do its labor. It can do its work, its industry in a much efficient way. Why? Because it has a division of powers. If the state didn't have a division of powers, it wouldn't be as powerful as it is today.
That's an interesting idea. I'm not quite sure. So the division of power makes the state powerful?
I think so. I think it's the same argument.
I haven't heard. I'd like to pursue that idea.
Because if you see the way that corporations grew larger in history is that they adopted this doctrine of the division of labor.
Yeah.
And the way the state grew larger in history is because it adopted the division of powers. Because you can employ more people who enforce and to create and to legislate and to judge. And the way that the state grows in power and in size is because it has a division of power. Any state that has not division of power has to be very small because there is few people to enforce and to have that power for themselves. That's why a medieval monarchy was going to be a lot smaller than any current modern state.
But that's simply not. I mean, I would challenge that thesis. What happened is, and I think, and monarchists don't do this. I'm a monarchist, but monarchists do not make a sufficient distinction between monarchism and royalism. And monarchy, in the beginning, the monarch sort of rules over a whole bunch of different powers. So there's the church, there's the guilds, there's the free cities, there's the nobilities, and the king kind of sits atop of these powers. But these powers are competing. Eventually, over time, the king absorbs all of these powers into himself. Okay, and that's the point of Hobbes' Leviathan, that all of these powers now are centered on the king. The problem is, when you establish royal sovereignty with all of the powers in one person, then you're preparing the way for an oligarchy. When the state has but one head, it becomes a very simple thing to chop that head off and replace it with a hydra-headed oligarchy masquerading as a democracy. So if you want a certain kind of monarchy would match what you were saying, but another kind of monarchy would be the exact opposite of what you were saying.
But that's the main difference between an absolute monarchy and a traditional monarchy. In the traditional monarchy, there are different competing powers, and there's only one figurehead of authority, which is the king, the monarch. And you have guilds, you have the church, you have the several feudal lords, and so on. So you have a lot of power, which is widely distributed, and you have only one authority. But in the absolute monarchy and in the modern state, you have a lot of power for a singular entity, which is either the king or the state, and you have authority distributed widely. So people think they have authority, but they don't have any power.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. I mean, I agree. And it all comes back, I think, to the establishment of individualism. In historical terms, we don't even have families anymore in the United States. We have something called the nuclear family, which is a temporary arrangement. It exists for 20 or 30 years, and then all the children fly off to various cities, and they have little contact with their grandparents, with their cousins, or even with their brothers and sisters. So in terms of history is always considered the family, the extended family. Okay, parents, grandparents, cousins, uncles, aunts, etc. That the modern life has kind of destroyed the family and reduced it to this nuclear family, which is a very, very powerless enterprise. And it's all based on this notion of individualism. We're not members of families, we're free individuals. Well, being free individuals leaves us naked in front of the state and the corporation.
Right. I think that's a good wrap. Thank you very much, John. Thank you for TJ. Yeah, thank you for TJ, who is no longer in the stream. Thank you again, because it's been a great talk. It's been well, I didn't talk as much as I usually do, but I listened, and I listened a lot of what both you and TJ said. I think I learned a lot. I mean, I could do another interview with you, and you might know about this person, Charles Coulomb. He's another monarchist and distributive. Yeah. So I think that we might do a talk only to talk about these particular things on both monarchism and distributism, which is not something that most people know. And I think that is a great counterbalance to the current very liberal, very libertarian mainstream in the conservative movement. Right. Thank you, John. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.